we'd like you to join Leticia Echlin in some recollections of San Miguel 30 years ago. Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, wrote in his wise way that although life has to be lived forwards, it can only be learned backwards. And so we hope that looking at San Miguel and at some recollections of it as it was 30 years ago will perhaps give you a warmer, perhaps deeper understanding of why it is what it is today. So, Leticia, take us back to the early 60s and tell us how it all was when you and Frank came.
Well, we were invited to San Miguel by Fred Taylor and his charming wife, Nova, who had just built a house here. He was a Canadian artist who'd got worse arthritic conditions through painting in the frozen north. Lovely snow scenes of the Laurentians, and he was very well known in Canada. But he found the climate here entirely up to his taste. And so he moved here, and Frank and he had been at school all their lives together through, except for a brief period. And so we came down in March 1963, and Fred came into Mexico City and met us at the Maria Cristina and drove us home and talked and told all kinds of tales about his first arrival and historic events and so on. He told us the whole story of the War of Independence and the part that San Miguel played in that, and so it was quite fascinating. And of course, we both, like everybody else, just fell in love with the architecture and the ambiance of the town. There were very few Americans in those days. Fred gave a great big fiesta for us, for almost all the foreign colony and intermarried groups and so on. And there was a great sum of 40 people at this fiesta. And strangely enough, that's almost the same figure that apparently about 10 years before had been the sum total of the foreign community. It was this early group around the Instituto, and not too many more people had come. And however, Frank and I decided to swell the ranks a bit when we retired, and so we looked around for a house to buy, and there were several on the market. And one of them was the first house that Javier Rabosa built here. It was designed like a French villa and had a very pretty garden. Another was Bessie James, who was the widow of Marquis James, the historian, and she had a gorgeous garden. But I'd been living at the bottom of the well, as it were, in New York, in a garden in Manhattan, surrounded by skyscrapers, and I didn't want to be down. I wanted to be on top. And when we were shown this rather decrepit ruin on the Salida, I said, well, this is for us. This is my idea of bliss. I didn't think of all the steps in my old age and the necessity of bringing a car into town to carry home the groceries. I didn't think of any of those things at all. I just thought, oh, I'm going to be on top with a view, a room with a view, and that's what I loved. So
it was this very house.
This very house.
And it was with that remarkable, marvelous architect, Francisco
Garcia. Well, he was married to a very clever American woman, Maggie, who'd been a landscape gardener. Mm-hmm. And he had been born, I believe, in Comonfort, in very humble surroundings. And by sheer genius, he really was very gifted. He had scrambled his way up to the top. And he was designing houses then. So Fred said, well, he's not really an architect, and if he had to design them, the whole bottom excavations and so on, you might slide down the hill, but he said as long as this house has been there for 100 years or more, I guess it'll stay put. And I remember coming into the sala, and there was a little door, really little doors and little windows for little people, and looking out on this wild rocky hillside with wonderful trees, and I just fell in love with it. So we gave Francisco a very modest amount of money and 3 years to restore this treasure. Well, in the summer, that was in the fall of '64 that we bought it, and in the summer of '65, I said to Frank, I think we'd better go and see what's going on down there with our house. Frank didn't want to go at all. He wanted to go to the Canadian woods, but anyway, we came down here and stayed at the Atascadero, and that time of year I'd never envisaged Mexico as green, and it was so beautiful up at the Atascadero. Every hillside was green, and the trees were covered with green leaves, and under every bush was a child with an animal which it was guarding. It was very, very, very charming. In those days there wasn't too much building at the Atascadero. There were just 2 or 3 houses. And so we came down in high hopes and looked at the house, tried to find Francisco Garcia. He was not available. We went to the house, and a neighbor let us in. She was the guardian, had the key. And all we could see that had been done was a great heap of sand in the sala and no activity whatsoever. So we were rather discouraged. I said to Frank, well, we might as well go home and leave it in the lap of the gods, and never mind whether the color scheme suits us or not. We'll just take a chance. And actually, I had adopted this laissez-faire attitude, being determined not to get harassed if things didn't go right, because I'd known people who'd really almost given themselves heart attacks with worry about if the bathroom tap wasn't what they had ordered. And actually, Fred Taylor himself, who was definitely very British Army tradition and upbringing in Canada, and looked English and talked English too. And he had really worried himself so much about the construction of his house. And every detail that went wrong, he would drive himself into a frenzy. And he adored Mexico, and he adored the Mexicans, and made the most sympathetic portraits of them, and of the landscape also. But he couldn't stand the corruptions and whatnot, and delays, and the mañana attitude.
My English husband said that the first thing to learn in Mexico was that mañana means only not today. Doesn't mean tomorrow.
Yeah, Guy was very acute. Well, going back to 1963 and 4, it was early on in that period that we went to a play at the Instituto, at the theater they're using now at the Instituto, and a small little repertory group of Americans was hopefully performing there. And of course, there was such a small Anglophone community that it was a dream. They couldn't possibly have made a go of it. But we did go and see Mr. Pym Passes By, which is the first time I was in the Instituto Theater, which has become so important to us all. And then there was some amateur theatricals going on, because Joelle Donovan, the wife of the St. Paul's Episcopalian Church rector, was keen on drama, and
and full of warmth and
she was a
and
darling,
interest, and a
yeah.
lovely human being.
And so Joelle was staging or doing a staged reading of Aria da Capo by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and also a little kind of opener. So I participated in the opener. And I thought, this is great fun. I had never thought of theatricals in connection with San Miguel. I knew Frank could paint. I didn't know what I'd do. I thought maybe I'd weave, which was perhaps a silly idea. I don't think I ever would have had the patience to weave.
Oh, that great big loom. Considerable theater background from Europe and New York.
Off and on, over the years, it has certainly been my hobby. And I had gone after college to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And I had founded North Broadway Theater and I had produced a play in London, a few little things, and I'd taught in, community centers, children and stuff. So, as I said, never had a continuous career in theater or anything, but always a tremendous interest.
Which gave you not only an impetus, but it gave you something else, and it gave the community something else. I believe that the sense of your having this experience made everybody find it more exciting and more interesting. And I remember very well when those first play readings began in the church that you mothered or godmothered, Tiger at the Gates.
Well, that was funny. We used to, in those days, put on these readings, and they weren't staged at all. They weren't even rehearsed. We'd crank out some mimeograph copies of the play, and then we'd just hand them around. Anybody who volunteered to perform, we were happy. One of the performances was of Tiger at the Gates, and I cast Mimi Loomer, who sadly has recently died, but a wonderful woman, and I cast her as Helen of Troy, and it was a really bitchy,
I remember well.
bitchy part. I mean, Giraudoux made Helen of Troy a real little tart. And Mimi was sailing along at the end of the second act. I thought, well, maybe I ought to give somebody else a shot at this very juicy part. And I said, Mimi, would you mind changing roles now? Would somebody else like to play it? There were several voices from the audience. They said, oh, leave her alone. She's doing fine. so we let Mimi finish the role. Well, we also did The Visit at that time by Dürrenmatt, and I think Linda was cast as in the Lynn Fontaine role, the visitor.
That was ambitious when I think about that. And then, of course, I remember with such deep pleasure that you began the Shakespeare readings in this very house.
Well, about 1970, so many people arrived who are interested in theater, and some of them were much more experienced than myself, like Hugh Chain, but he started an actor's workshop, and people went to that, and Linda and Jules Chasuble and Hugh Chain. And there were wonderful people who came at that time. The Roskins and the Harrisons were in and out. And I mean, they were not here long enough, but when they were here, they were a great addition. Well, now is a very good time to let you all know that my darling interviewer is Ceil Harrison herself, who's contributed a great deal to the theater here, and has had wide experience, and was always extremely helpful when she was here in the early days. In the Shakespeare, and Guy, of course, her husband, who was a great musician, he adored Shakespeare, loved reading it. And there was Felix Green, another Englishman, who was very good, and Monty Lewis was pretty good in Shakespeare. So we had a wonderful time. Patricia and Leonard. Patricia was wife of Leonard Robinson. They were both in the English department at the Instituto, and the Delat were here in those early days. And they were both, Delat was a very good writer, and Nancy was a very good actress. So we were very fortunate, what with the English department and the visiting Northerners.
It was lively. There was no question about it. And the Instituto, as a matter of fact, the English department, was a very warming and heartening part of this whole development. Yes. And that was it about the time that Tom Scott and Bob Summerlock came?
Yes, they came around that time, before the 70s, in the late 60s, I guess, but in the 70s they were very active in all the
wonderful Guys and Dolls, and
that's later.
Is that later? And Sly Fox. You see, it slips the memory. Well, Leticia, how very grateful we should be, but you must be now to realize that there's a full-fledged Readers Theater the play readers of San Miguel that meet every other week for most of the year, and that we have indeed a company in almost, I think it's fair to say, in the Players Workshop, mounting 7 productions every year.
Very good,
It's
too.
quite a
Tremendous.
remarkable history in many ways.
So that anybody who comes here who has an interest in any of the arts has got a venue. They've got the theater or the readings or the Shakespeare readings, or they can join a music group. There always have been active chamber music groups. I remember when I first came here, see, Leonard Brooks was not only an artist, but he was also a violinist and loved playing. And soon they had a very good group of chamber music.
Oh yes, there was a little chamber orchestra that met.
And Margaret Gallagher was directing it at that time, and she asked Guy Stewart, who was a famous conductor from the United States, if he would like to take a rehearsal of Mozart, a piece by Mozart, I cannot remember what. And of course, Guy was a great Mozart expert, and he nearly drove these amateurs mad, because he would say, take that passage again, and he would do it again and again. And you might remember.
I remember very well. I remember being apprehensive to a degree. And I said to him on the way to the rehearsal, Guy, how do you treat an amateur orchestra? And he said, as if they were professionals.
Well, this rather abashed the amateurs, but anyway, I think they learned something from that. They had to be a little more disciplined, perhaps.
Well, it was a lively place. There was a lot of music, really a lot of music. And later, Phyllis Roskin and her very
Yes, because
special.
Jules and Phyllis were a great addition. They came in the 70s.
But the social scene was really a lively one. I remember very well being surprised and delighted. And tell about Les Alpinistes,
Oh, well.
the walks we did on Sundays.
Well, that was such fun. Fred Taylor's a great walker, and he organized a group on Sunday afternoon. And we'd set off about after Comida, and we'd go for a hike every Sunday, and then we'd land up for sort of high tea at somebody's house, because in Canada we were used to having high teas. Tea with a little something to it. And so sometimes it would be at Fred's house, sometimes at our house, whoever was on the walk. And then on Boxing Day every year we had a special thing that anybody could join. We'd make an expedition, take a picnic lunch, and go to some fascinating place around here. Bernal was one of our favorites. And then we also went to Uriria much later in time, but we discovered quite a lot of charming places around here. And this is one of our Boxing Day expeditions. You can see our leader, Fred Taylor, the large gentleman, and then there's children and elderly ladies and the whole gang straggling across the Laja River near Totonilco, where those 2 wonderful little chapels are. And at that time you could walk for miles along the Laja River. There weren't any fences or anything. Now they seem to have erected all kinds of fences. It's much more difficult to walk in just anywhere.
But it really was lovely. It had a curiously exotic kind of look about it, the countryside and the animals. And
it all looked like something out of Bible scenes.
Yes, it did. Well, from the country, you have to tell about the fancy dress parties, because they were so lively and they were so inventive. And we danced a lot. I'd see you and Frank dancing away. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Life was wonderful.
Well, we used to have rent musicians in those days, and that was still fairly reasonable proposition. Nowadays I think it'd be a little difficult for me to do that, but there was lots of room here to dance, and we had some jolly parties for a couple of years, and I have some pictures of those if you'd like, because almost people spent a tremendous amount of time and effort on their costumes because all these people had been involved in one form of theater or another. And the one we have here is Linda Keogh and Alice Stark on the left, and on the right, Alice and Bill's daughter, Polly. And she was dark, lovely eyes and hair, and she had a hollowed out cabbage on her head. I don't know if you could distinguish that, but she looked absolutely stunning.
That is going with the best of the lot, the most creative.
And this is another one. Here's another one of Linda in that costume. And I think she's got half a horse beside her that might be the rear end, which was John Clark. I think he and Paula were keen on riding. They came as a horse, I think.
I remember that.
Now we have Linda again in that same fabulous costume. And we also, on the right, have the rear end of a horse. Now, it seems to me that Paul and John Clark, who were riders, came as a horse, a front and rear, so we only have the rear in this picture. Here we have Fernand Lewis as the Maid of Orleans. It was hecho in Mexico. With my husband, Frank Echlin, who was some sort of a gay cavalier, in a velvet smoking jacket and a large velvet hat, which I concocted. And I think it was suitable. Now here we have Leonard Brooks as Nero playing his fiddle, which was quite appropriate, and Reva on his left. And on his right is Dean Underwood, who had just arrived to be the new rector at St. Paul's. And he and Nancy, who had always been a stage person and a great pro, continued the tradition of the Donovans, of this interest that St. Paul's took in all our activities. And so it was great to have the Underwoods coming along.
Oh, haven't they made a warm and wonderful contribution to this community?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed.
Here we have Tommy Seidenberg. Now, Tommy contributed a great deal over the years to the play readers. And she's looking very elegant, and she's talking to Mrs. Needler, who was here briefly. Here we have Cappy Rice, who is such a well-known San Miguelian for so long and had that wonderful shop, Solo Concita, her house on the Salida for many years. And she temporarily deserted us for Los Alamos, but she's back in the fold now, thank goodness. And the other gentleman with her is Alan Kahn, of course, from Indianapolis.
Alan and Ellen.
Alan and his darling wife, Eleanor. But Alan did the photographs for the first book, I think, that was ever published about San Miguel. It was called Hilltown, and it was written by Alan Smart, and Alan Kahn did the photographs for it. Alan and Eleanor built the first house on the Atascadero grounds. The land was sold by Mr. Mycott, who'd bought the whole hacienda, and it created that very nice hotel that we used to stay at so often. And Alan had a house nearby, and it was very attractive. He was also quite an art patron. Now here we have Guy Fraser Harrison as Old Man Time with his shears. He's going to cut the thread, and he's just cut open the big cake on the right, which Beryl Bancroft constructed, and inside it was hidden my little grandson Jason, who must have been about 5 or something then, I don't know. Anyway, there the two of them are together, the old year and the new year, as it were.
Jason was reluctant, but behaved extremely well. And now Jason is a great lad at university.
Yes,
and
indeed.
gladdens our Christmases from time to time.
Yes. And now, here I am. I think I was supposed to be Lady Macbeth. I think so. And with some uninvited guests, some little neighboring children who heard the music and saw the lights and so on, thought they might as well join in the fun, and they rang the bell, and we welcomed them in and gave them cokes and stuff, and then shooed them on home.
And it was terribly tempting to the neighborhood children, because you remember, we had fireworks and globos and all those glamorous appurtenances that just brought them all here.
Yeah, the globos would sail off into the sky. Sometimes the wind would be in the wrong direction and they'd get lost behind the trees. Other times they'd sail right over the town and they'd carry all your dreams and wishes with them. No. But I was going to say, we also had other amusements, outdoor sports. I mean, some people played tennis, and they were just starting up the golf club in 1970. I'm not sure the exact date, but most of us weren't golfers, but we were all swimmers, so we'd all rush out to the different hot pools. Our favorite one, I think, at that time was, well, we liked Cortillo best, but Taboada was very good too, and especially the smaller one that now is exclusive to the hotel and you can only get into if you've spent an enormous amount of money on a horrible lunch. But in those days, the hotel pool you could get into for a small fee, and then they built the Olympic-sized pool later. And that was always nice, especially all winter long. There was hardly anybody swimming. I mean, you get in your car with some friends and go out there. And the Cortijo was very especially interesting. There was a lovely old pool there. And Mr., what was his name? Perez, I think.
Perez, I think.
He owned that whole property, and he was an eccentric, and he had a mind of his own. He loved talking to gringos. He knew a little English, and so he'd, in between cleaning pools, which he did vigorously, he would have a chat. And but if he took a hate to you, God help you, he'd been known to take a shotgun to somebody he didn't approve of. I mean, those were the old free days, you know. I remember Fred telling us that how the police force operated. Somebody tried to leave the Monjas Hotel, which was definitely a Mexican hotel, as you know, very charming. But they tried to leave without paying the bill, so the Mexican owners phoned the police. The police came and just shot out the tires. That was very simple.
And
So-
to them, quite reasonable. I
Yes,
feel
it was.
certain.
No, I mean,
Well,
you know,
it was a lovely time. And you know, one of the wonderful things that I remember later, of course, was Jules Roskin and his lecture series.
Well, Jules
And Phyllis.
also had a wife called Phyllis, who was a very gifted pianist, and she would, as part of his lecture series, which he instituted in the full season of January, February, and early March at the Instituto, twice a week, lectures on everything. And sometimes it would be on music, and Phyllis would play two piano with various
Yes.
visiting pianists and so on. And she had been a music teacher in Cleveland, I think, when she was before her marriage. And she was very good at explaining all kinds of...
She had a very good and succinct sort of style of music history, and she made it very, very interesting and lively.
Yes, she
for
did.
audiences.
And then she would play passages to illustrate
Yes.
same.
In the best fashion whatsoever.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And one time, Jules asked me to give 2 lectures on history of drama. And I thought, dear me, if I get up there at the pulpit and talk away, it'll be very boring. So I enlisted some friends to help me, and I have a picture of that. Here I am in the middle, and I'm surrounded by my collaborators that I enlisted. On the extreme right is Linda Keogh with one of her fabulous puppets, and all the masks and puppets that you see were created by Linda and were used in this lecture series. I remember throughout, Linda did the movement and the puppets, and of course puppets were very important in the early theater especially. And next to her is Rosemary Malkin, who had a beautiful speaking voice, and she played most of the straight women's roles in drama that we used excerpts of. And then we have our only male that I thought would be enliven things a bit to have one man in the group. And he was a photographer, but he had a very pleasant voice. And I remember I limited the series to not the history of drama, just of Western drama. So we started out with some Greek, I think maybe Lysistrata, and then we went on to Roman Plautus and so on, using the masks. And I ended the first section with the great scene of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, but 1 hour more. And Dawn did that very well. And Margaret, I asked to join in for the history of music in the theater. And she's on the extreme left with some sort of instrument which she had built. She was great at building as well as repairing and using various instruments. I'm going to go on with some of our more intellectual pursuits. And another very charming person who was here and had bought an old house on Santo Domingo, which had been a tannery. It was one of the very oldest structures in San Miguel.
Right beside the arches, because you're going to say Ellie Martin, aren't
Yes.
you? Yes.
That's right, beside the arches. And this house had belonged to Chavez Machado. Oh, is that right? Yes, Chavez Machado, the muralist who later was director of the museum in the Alhóndiga in Guanajuato and created that museum. Of course, it's been added to since his death, but he was a very creative man, and his murals there are very fine, I think, in the Mexican mural tradition. And he donated his own private pre-Columbian collection to the city of Guanajuato, or the state of Guanajuato, and it's housed there. So Ellie Martin moved into that house, which was very intriguing. And she was a very lively, intelligent lady from Chicago, had done a great deal to promote chamber music in Chicago area, and had raised money and financed the Fine Arts Quartet. And she had the great idea of why not in this beautiful town have a music festival. So she got together with Carmen Masip de Hawkins, who was director of Bellas Artes and interested in all the arts and promoting them, and Tom Sawyer, who was active in the chamber music group here. And he'd been a businessman as well as a early television and radio that he'd made his career, and he was musical, and he had he's a very good businessman as well as an organizer, which was needed for all this. And he and Carmen still head up this wonderful summer music festival, which Ellie Martin did so much to promote in the beginning. And they invite very good chamber groups here, top notch. And they come here every summer, and then they have a scholarship program for young Mexican musicians who have to send in a photograph and a small tape of their performance, and they can come here and study with these very accomplished chamber music.
It's an enormous contribution to the community.
And of course, since then we have also a winter festival. That's totally different because that isn't a teaching festival. That is just for our delight. That Mr. Munguia, Gilberto Munguia, has started. Going back to early days in the theater, as I say, Hugh Chain was directing then. And then a man called Joe Gottlieb and his wife Sarah arrived in San Miguel. And he'd been with NBC for many years as a theater director and program director. And he loved the play readings, but we had been doing, as I say, some staged readings all along. I remember back in the early 70s directing a Phoenix Too Frequent by Christopher Fry and photo finish by Ustinov, both at the Bellas Artes, staged readings. But still we had really hung on to our rather harum-scarum casting from the floor, rather impromptu way. But Joe thought we really ought to go more into the staged readings, which we did. The audience seemed to get more out of it. I mean, there's always been a little controversy here. The purists who want pure readings and the staged reading people. So, I mean, that little controversy is still going on. There's still some people who disapprove of the play readings because they're staged readings. But personally, I couldn't really tear the place apart on a conviction of it one way or the other. I'm quite happy to do whatever comes along. So we had then a very good director from the States arrive here called Blanche Trues. And she was an excellent director and did some full productions at Bellas Artes.
Very good ones.
Yes.
Arthur Miller.
Oh, yes, Arthur Miller. And, she did a wonderful Equus. And she did a Shot in the Dark. I can't remember the author. I think it was a French play originally. But Lisa Miller, who was Mimi Loomer's daughter, I said Lisa Miller, I meant Lisa Loomer, who is now, has just recently received some big award as the second woman playwright of the world, or in English. I mean, she apparently went to England and got this, and I wish her mother could have known about that. But her mother had seen several of her plays produced before she died on TV and so on. So she was in that. We had a hard time keeping the play readings going while the productions were being done because there weren't enough people to call on who were experts enough. We were always happy to have new people, but we needed a backbone of a few experts to hold a play reading together. So unfortunately, Blanche got ill and could not come back, so we went into our play readings hot and strong. And between, I think in 1979, 78 and 79, we did about 36 play readings at the church. And then, from then on, we started to keep a book. And we've had, I think, about at least 20 or more productions every year since then, every year since 1980. And we have a list of those, and of course, the innumerable authors. I mean, really, we have not neglected, I think, any.
I wouldn't say so.
No. We've tried to, we're not as strong on Shakespeare on public, but we're very strong on the play readings which take place at the Woden's house now, because at my house, it was a terrible job. Frank didn't like overhead lighting, and we had these extension cords running all over the place, and people would trip over them, and it was very precarious. So Bob Woden, I have to introduce the Wodens at this point. Bob Woden, who was really keen, put in wonderful lighting at his house on Jesus, and that's where the Shakespeare readings have been ever since, and people can see, which is wonderful advantage when you're reading.
I think to the enormous relief of Frank Echlin, who was very good about it. But it was not his favorite thing to read. He had to be coerced to read.
Anyways, I remember the Wodens arrived, I forget exactly the year, around the early 80s, I think. And I was cast in as a gangster, Bob Woden, as a gangster in Sam Shepard's Curse of the Starving Classes. And he was so thrilled, and he came to me and he said, "Do I look all right?" And he had his hat on at a George Raft angle, and he had a big cigar, you know. So I thought to myself, oh, this is somebody who's really going to be good at this. So that was his first role, and from then he never stopped going.
Oh, you opened a whole wide world of Woden.
Yes. Oh, Guys and Dolls. That
He was wonderful.
Yeah, and wonderful in all kinds of roles. He was a very all-round person, yeah, and really keen. And his wife, Jerry, who had had more theatrical experience, I think she'd worked in radio and stuff before they were married, whereas Bob had never been anything but an audience, an aficionado in the audience. But Jerry was very helpful because she was quite organized, and everything went more on time when Jerry was involved. I mean, you know, we wouldn't not have a show if we didn't feel like it. We'd have a show. And I guess the first revival of the productions after Blanche Trues left was Bob Summerlot, who acted in, and I guess, who directed?
Sly Fox.
It was Volpone, an adaptation of Johnson's
yes.
Volpone. It was called The Sly Fox, and Bob Summerlot was just wonderful in it. And I guess
Hugh
Tom.
Chain and Tom. I think Tom directed.
Tom Scott
Hugh Chain.
directed.
I wasn't here, but I know that it was a marvelous
Yes,
piece.
it really was.
And then,
And
because
then-
the Guys and Dolls was.
Then the Guys and
Who would have
Dolls
thought?
came along with Bob Woden, and there was some other clever people had arrived, and that was a great success. And so then that started the Players Workshop,
Which has grown up.
and now has 7 very good first-class productions a year at the Instituto, because I missed a whole bit back in the early day history. There was a wonderful little theater, a wonderful theater here, which was had been created in the Diaz Porfirio days, when theaters were encouraged, and it was the thing to do, and it was called after an opera singer from here, Angela Peralta. And it had been a movie house and been used for political meetings, and it was sort of a ratty hole, but the facade was very elegant. And Lucha Maxwell and Carmen Macipta Hawkins and some Anglophones started this Asociación Cultural de San Miguel Allende. And the first productions in there were 2 Gilbert and Sullivan operas. And this was instigated by a wonderful pair called Grace and George Wallace. I'm almost sure that's the name. And Gladys Shook, who built the Shook House at the foot of Garita, which is still a very favorite bed and breakfast place, lovely house, and Constance Alston, who's recently died but lived here for so long. They were both very active in raising money, and we had all these categories that they have today, you know, benefactors and patrons and whatnot. And we did raise enough money to clean up and put in seats, and we had an English artist, a very good trompe-l'oeil artist. He was able to do lovely decor around the boxes and over the proscenium and so on. We never had the money to fix the backstage area, which had needed bathrooms and dressing rooms and storage facilities and all that, or the roof. But still, we had it working, and it was very charming, wasn't it?
It was perfectly lovely. It had an elegance And that was John Beadle, wasn't it, who did
Yes,
who did the trompe-l'oeil?
Yeah.
And it was lovely, sort of pale, mauvish gray, I remember. And I remember, and I think it must have been the opening, that a troupe came from Mexico and sang Trovatore.
Yes.
And the soprano was
another-
considerably pregnant. Nobody minded.
Another one was, yes, they did that, and they did Madame Butterfly.
Butterfly.
Yes, and we had a Yugoslav orchestra, no, dance troupe, folklore troupe, and we had, this was really very funny, we had a chamber music group from Poland who were traveling in Mexico. And they were all these beautiful blonde creatures. They were very expert on their various instruments. And among the audience, among the people here, was a woman who came from Krakow. And so she went up to the director of the orchestra afterwards, and I guess in German, asked him if he'd ever met a gentleman that she knew in Krakow. And he said, well, I'm wearing his tails.
Ah, lovely.
They were very hard up in those days, the Poles, and they were all in borrowed plumage for this trip to Mexico. But there was not one brunette among them. I think they were all eliminated or something. They were all blonde Poles, not wonderful Jewish fiddlers, but they were good. As I say, these Wallaces contributed to a great deal at that time because they listed the whole community in these Gilbert and Sullivan. The first one they did was Pinafore, and the soprano was a Mexican, sang in Spanish, and the chorus managed in English somehow, and they were all sweeping the decks or swabbing, I remember, busily and having a great time, and it was very good community relations. And Mrs. Alfred Newberg played the accompaniment for all these rehearsals, endless rehearsals. And the next one they did, I don't think I was here for, was, I believe, Pirates of Penzance. But I remember the Pinafore very vividly. And Mr. Walter Newberg, who'd always sung Gilbert and Sullivan as a hobby, sang the Admiral of the Queen's Navy with great gusto. So it was fun. And,
there's always been a nice and strong tradition of volunteerism in this community.
Yeah.
People really work hard.
Yeah.
Isn't it nice to be able to say? So what you're saying, I guess, is that, what?
If you want to come and live in San Miguel, there's innumerable good works you can indulge in, like the library and the Niños and Casa and so on. And so if you're strongly inclined towards community activity of that kind, there are a lot of men who've retired, who've taken up all kinds of tremendous work.
Forces and whatever.
Yes, and they go out into the countryside with Sterling Dickinson and deliver medical supplies and school books and do all kinds of things.
Yes.
And then there's the lighter vein of the arts that you can participate in.
And I guess we're saying, as those canny French said, the more things change, in a way, the more they remain the same.
Uh-huh.
So, put it together, Leticia. Heaven knows it's a whole different world here, but in many ways, there's a resemblance to the beginning of people being interested in the arts, and they're being lively, intelligent, people attracted to this little Eden.
I think so, and that goes on, so that there's
Yes.
new blood coming in all the time. I mean, look at our fabulous lady here who's only been here about 10 years and has brought so much, Adeline and
Exactly,
Naomi
and
Medallia.
Naomi, of course they
Yes. So they're about things changing, but they do remain the same. And I think basically the fundamental feeling of most people here is so much the same: interest in the arts, interested in people, and interested in helping But externally, there have been a lot of changes. I mean, just more houses, more. I mean, over the empty hills towards the lake, there's now housing developments with orange lights to the horror of the purists, and a lot more traffic. And I would like to show you an example of that right here on my wall. This is an architect's rendering. Fred Taylor was originally an architect of the Salida Querétaro, and on the left you'll notice the bells and the tower at the top of Correo Street. The traffic consists of one elderly lady pottering along. There was one bus a day to Mexico City and one back. And today the Salida is, unfortunately for us, a very busy thoroughfare. So that just shows that externals change, but internals perhaps do not.
There you have it. San Miguel, 30 years ago, and San Miguel today, and thank you, Leticia.
Thank you, Ceil, and thank you, Adeline.
Adeline.